the important people are here, so I can start. Is that the message here? Good afternoon. I'm Billy Hollis, developer turned designer. Started writing code for money in 1978, if you can imagine that. Some of you weren't alive. You were not, I bet. I spend my time mostly helping teams of developers usually, that have decided to start leveraging design and design thinking. When I started doing this back in 2008, almost no development teams were doing anything I would really recognize as UX design, but that has changed over the years. As William Gibson said, the future's here, it's just not evenly distributed. You might find yourself somewhere along this path here. Most teams start out doing fairly simple things like visual design, getting the aesthetics right. I still run into teams, though, that are just throwing walls of data grids at their users. So that still absolutely does happen. But I see teams kind of moving through this set of possibilities. But because they are still trying to find their way, in many cases, they're still learning how to do it. There's certainly the possibility for failing at design because you're new at it. And that's what this session is about, to maybe help you avoid some approaches. Now, I understand why teams haven't made as much progress, maybe, as we might ideally like for them to in UX design. It's not as if you don't have a lot of other things to worry about now, is it? You got the cloud, you got AI, you got DevOps, and a breach every other week. And in addition to those problems, another holdup in getting to a good place in design is that developers tend to be rather code-centric, and as a result, they prefer writing code over almost anything else, and sometimes they'll just basically blow off all the other things that they really ought to do in order to get back to writing code. So I really get that, and the result that comes from that, though, and the reason why you ought to have somebody on your team that sort of understands the importance of design and tries to get good at it, is because if you don't, you'll run into design failures. There are lots of those out there, lots of examples of them. I like to start out with this one because it's a $1 trillion project that arguably failed, partially because of design. $1 trillion. Now, I like to put that in context for people that don't use US dollars. That's 1.5 Polands in terms of, that's the 1.5 times the GDP of Poland that was spent on this aircraft program that so far has produced about 700 planes. And spending that much money, you think, okay, they got this right, didn't they? I mean, how could anybody spend that much? No, they're government. Of course they messed up. And this article summarizes a lot of the reasons why. And you're welcome to go look at this if you like. There are various ways that they failed. One of them was that the architecture of the code was done very poorly. And I won't talk about that here, but if you are interested in architecture, here's the book you want to read for that, Writing Software by Yuval Lowy. But the main things that they did that really worked out very poorly, from my perspective, is that's just almost inexcusable, is poor UX design. Because poor UX design can absolutely lead to catastrophic results. And in a program that big, with life and death on the line, whenever a pilot steps into that plane, it's kind of unforgivable. So here is one of the extracts from that article that discusses where the design went wrong. And I don't normally like reading from slides, but in this case, it's a big enough deal that I'll make an exception. The fighter jet also suffers from a slightly embarrassing touchscreen problem. After making the switch from hard flip switches to touchscreens, skip it on down, touchscreens in the plane don't work 20% of the time, says one F-35 pilot. Well, look at the layers of failure that are involved here. That they put these things in place, They didn't understand the psychology of the user. They didn't understand the value of tactile switches. No, they sat around in a meeting one day and said, oh, it's probably helpful to remember when this is. This is when the iPhone was taking over the world, when a lot of this design was done. So I'm sure they're sitting there with their brand new iPhones and going, touchscreens are the future. They're programmable. Look at all the things we can do to upgrade the fighter jet over time if we don't have mechanical switches. This is a stock photo, of course, but it's how I imagine the meeting went. Now, to avoid that kind of failure, if you're a developer team, you need to do something that some developer teams are good at, but let's be honest about it, some of them are not. And that is to put yourself in the mind of the user. I want you right now to close your eyes or stare off in the distance and visualize flying a fighter jet. And I want you to think all the distractions that you might engage, not to mention the fact that your life might be on the line with a 1/10 of a second reaction time. Now, think about turning something on and the physical difference between hitting a touchscreen button, which you do lots of times every day, and flipping a mechanical switch. Just think about that difference there. And think about the potential risk that comes from that. Pilots really can't afford a 20% failure rate on flipping a switch. That's just ridiculous. Now, to put yourself in kind of a comparable, not nearly as dangerous situation, what would happen if one of your users thought they'd entered an order, but the software didn't think it happened? If that happened regularly in your software, what would be the ramifications for your team? Would that be considered acceptable by your business? Absolutely not. So why did they do that? Well, as they're sitting there in that meeting that I visualized, I'm thinking, because this was the iPhone era and this is the new technology, that somewhere along the line the phrase was uttered, wouldn't it be cool if we did touchscreens in the fighter jet? And I consider that a huge red flag. When I teach design classes, mostly to developers, I really focus on considering, when they hear that phrase, they ought to step back. Now, not all cool things should be rejected as something to fold into a new design. But you ought to always make sure that you're not doing it primarily because it's cool, and that it does in fact fit the circumstances, which in this case, those cool touchscreens do not. So be careful of that as you go through. I try to teach developers not to do that. The result may look absolutely cool, but if it doesn't accomplish the purposes to which the project was dedicated, then the coolness doesn't help, doesn't make up for the fact that there's a severe problem there. Now, sometimes, and I don't want you to do this either, but when that much money's been spent, the excuses started to pour out. One of the generals, this is a direct quote in that article from the general, "You don't drive your Ferrari to work every day, you only drive it on Sundays. This is our high-end fighter. We don't want to use it on the low-end fight." Well, what if you created a next-generation app and it was really cool? It had all the latest technologies in it. It looked very modern, but it was clunky. It was so ill-suited to what the users do on a routine basis, the most important things they do, that it slowed them down or made them ineffective in other ways. So you're talking to the person who signed the check, and you say, well, this is our Ferrari-level app, and it's not intended to be used every day after he's already spent all the money on it. How far is that going to get you with him? That's pretty ridiculous, isn't it? So I looked at this thing and wondered what these people should have done. Well, first of all, they should have had a world-class architect. The article that I referenced talks a lot about the code difficulties and the bugs that came out of that. Something like 8 times the code of the fighter jet generation preceding it, and very buggy. But they also needed a world-class designer. They needed to not do the overuse of the cool stuff, and they needed to really spend a lot more time to understand and aim at the intended user, the pilot. And lest you think this is just kind of a one-off thing, I actually had, on a much smaller scale, an example from one of my clients that did a browser-based app for order entry of and hooking up expedited freight, happened to be the domain. They'd been using this AS400 app for years. This was supposed to replace it. They rolled it out, and it was so much slower for a user to get the order done that the users rebelled and said, no, stick our AS400 back in here. We are not going to, because they were paid on commission, you see. Those people had a vested interest in getting the orders done as quickly as possible. It's money in their pockets. So the browser-based app was jumped, and the project was started all over again. Now, when I looked at the browser-based app, it had all the modern, cool browser stuff. It was just too hard and slow to use. It didn't fit the flow of what those people did when they got expedited freight orders into the system. So it was jumped. Oh, you want to see an example from Microsoft. Microsoft has, if you're going to talk about bad design, you'll be able to find an example from Microsoft somewhere. And I'm known, I know a lot of people at Redmond. I get up to campus quite often, and I'm kind of considered by some of them to be the crank who's always pointing out, no, you got this wrong. I've been doing that for 20 years now, and some of them don't even listen to me anymore, but some of the ones that do say, keep doing it, Billy. It does keep us on our toes. Let's talk about something from Microsoft called Story Remix. For how many of you does that ring a bell? One person. It was in the keynote at Microsoft Build in 2017. Now, do you understand that Build is where they roll out their newest stuff that's supposed to have a huge impact on their customer base? So this was in the keynote. What does Story Remix do? Well, basically, the demo that was in the keynote was inserting explosions into home videos. They had a video of a soccer team, like middle schoolers, and somebody kicked the ball into the net and it exploded when it went in the net. That was the demo. You probably think I'm joking. I'm going to show it to you right now. Oops, sorry, I had everything closed, and some of you know I had a blue screen. It caused me to have to reload a bunch of stuff. Okay, I've got a little animation here. I'm going to open it with the Photos app. It would, by default, go to Movies and TV. You ever seen these reloading animations that are kind of from games, except that they're really kind of, to be funny, this is like a gun that bites the ammo when it reloads. All right. Well, let's put an explosion into it. Now, you have to know where this is, because it's like they spent all that money and they're not going to throw it away, even though that nobody wants it or needs it. So what you have to do is go to, first of all, let's get this thing sort of at the point that it needs to be, where they've just fired a bullet. Right about there, I think. I may not be exactly right, but you'll get the idea here. And if we start walking down the menus, there's the Edit More, Add 3D Effects right here. And since I had to reboot from the blue screen, oh, it came up, good. I had one time earlier when I was practicing that it did not. So, oh no, I guess I have to also kind of position it here. So we do it just at the point where, okay, yeah, there you can see where I fired. So I'm going to put the explosion just at the point of firing, something like that. See this explosion right here? I'll put it where I think the bullet ought to go, something like this. You ready? So now, back to the beginning. Okay, look, this is fun, and I'm sure a middle schooler could occupy herself for however long, putting explosions in videos that they take on their phone. I completely concede that point. But this is supposed, anybody ever been to Build? At that point, we would have a keynote with 5,000 people in a giant hall watching the keynote up on stage. And they put explosions in videos as part of the keynote. So that's a pretty extreme case of wouldn't it be cool if. I mean, nobody really needed this but maybe middle schoolers. Certainly normal Windows users absolutely did not. And it's a complete waste of development dollars. So that's an example of trying to be too cool, and very often one of the causes of that is you move to a new platform and you want to use the stuff that's on it. Many of you are probably doing software today on platforms, for example, that don't really support animation effectively. If you have older HTML or you have something like Windows Forms or some of the Java toolkits from 15 years ago, you can't really do animation. So one of the things I see teams do is when they go to animations, they just go crazy with them. I had a story I like to tell about this because I work in the desktop world mostly, native software development. And I was working with a client that did a software package, evaluating their user experience. And I saw that they put in a page flipping animation, right? There was a little section with some information, and when you switched to another page, it would flip over to the side. Now, that is the sort of thing that is cool the first time you see it, and boy, do you get tired of it in a hurry. Just like these dancing things here, these Lottie animations. Animation has a very short time span before it becomes tedious. So I walked up to the screen and pointed at the page flipping animation and said, "Don't do that." And everybody in the room laughed except for the president of the company, because it was his idea to put the page flipping animation in. But he and I became good friends. He turned out to be really good at it. So that's one example of where you can get into trouble by trying to be too cool. And of course, if you want to talk about design failures, including this problem as well as a bunch of others, there's Windows 8. I watched Windows 8 rolled out on stage at Build 2011 and immediately went, oh, this is going to fail so hard. And I tried telling some Microsoft people, and they did not want to hear it. And I'll explain why here in just a minute. Fortunately, one of the foremost usability UX design people in the world is Jakob Nielsen. Are you familiar with him, the Nielsen-Norman group in Europe? And he wrote an article summarizing all the stuff I would like to tell them. And of course, we now know at the end of the day that Windows 8 was a failure. And some of us understood why. Because some of us understood why, it was a preventable failure. The team that was doing it got into the trying to make it cool like the iPad was cool. Because understand that a lot of the motivation behind Windows 8 was that the iPad was just taking over the world at that time while they were creating it. And Microsoft was worried that Apple was going to do to them what they did to IBM, make everything they did obsolete by moving to an entirely new platform. The fact that the iPad really was never going to get there, that they didn't really get that. I mean, I bought an iPad in 2010 to understand the new technology, the new interaction patterns. And people ask me, what do you think of the iPad? My grandma loves her iPad. And I go, yes, and your 3-year-old likes her speak and spell too, but neither of them have any work to get done. And that was what Microsoft missed. Tablets are fine, mostly for consuming and for light creation of things, creating light emails and such. But Microsoft's entire customer base was people who get work done to make the economy work. So they completely missed that. They were another example of really not listening to the user and not understanding what the user's needs were. And then there's another problem with it. They wanted it to be cool. Oh, they so desperately wanted it to be cool. And they could tell you all the design things they put in that they considered modern and cool. The problem with that is, and you know this, there's probably somebody in your high school, hopefully not you, who had this problem. They tried so hard to be cool, but if you try to be cool, you're almost certainly going to fail at it. That's just the nature of being cool. And so what we ended up with was this operating system that was basically trying to wave a flag. Look how cool I am. Look at me. And with horrible design flaws, such as the page where all the apps were. Now, this was just horrible. Now, understand there were no folders in Windows 8. If it hadn't been for the search box in the upper right, this would have been completely useless because nobody would have bothered scanning through to try to find the app that they wanted. But this is bad enough, and it's bad because, well, we can identify the reason. There's a fundamental design principle. Design principles being things that concern how the brain and visual system work, that determine what people are going to understand and like and what they're not. One design principle is Hick's law. It's common sense, though, really, that the longer the list of stuff you have to choose from, the longer it's going to take you to find the thing you want. Now, there's mathematical equations. They've kind of checked how much the delta is if you add more stuff. But the essential nature of Hick's law is just that you slow people down when you add things. So this was obviously a bad idea. So didn't they get some user feedback? Well, yes, they did. But there's two things about this problem that I want to illustrate as their mistakes so that you hopefully will not repeat some of what they did. Yeah, they got user feedback, but obviously they didn't do it very well because Windows 8 was so quickly just slammed when it made itself into the market. With good user feedback, they would have known what was going to happen and hopefully made adjustments, but they didn't. And that's a common problem when technologists just are so convinced that what they produced is cool. Of course everybody will like it. And they don't really get that the rest of the population is not as lit up by cool as we are. Somebody didn't get that. So why did the feedback go wrong? Well, let me tell you. There's a famous story that illustrates what the problem there is. And this is something that every development team should understand as a principle to be careful when you try to go get user feedback. Anybody heard of Clever Hans? You know Clever, okay. So, and you've seen it too. For those of you who want to know a lot more about Clever Hans, there's a nice Wikipedia article on it where I got this picture right here. Clever Hans was a horse that toured Europe 120 years ago. And Clever Hans could do arithmetic. Seriously, you bring out Clever Hans and say, Hans, what is 3 plus 5? And Hans would begin stamping his foot, and he would stamp 8 times, and he would stop. And he could do arithmetic. Well, some people got suspicious, and they took the handler away, thinking the handler was signaling Hans. But Hans could still do it. And then what they did, good suspicious experimenter, they asked Hans the question, took everybody that knew the question, that knew the answer, out of the room and put other people in. And now Hans just keeps on stamping. What was Hans doing originally? Well, it turned out that the crowd would tense up a little bit when he began to stamp. Will he stamp enough? Will he get to the right answer? And then, when he did, they would almost imperceptibly relax. And that's what Hans was picking up on. Hans learned what people wanted from their body language. Well, if a horse can do it, don't you think a human being can do it too? When you go to solicit feedback We are social animals, and people are tuned to pick up your preferences, and in many cases, if there's no great cost one way or the other, they'll reflect back to you what they believe you want to hear, whether it's really their opinion or not. And so people who are getting user feedback learn to keep their body language neutral, for example, and don't give people the feedback that tells them what you want to hear. So that was one of the big problems with Windows 8, is that, yeah, they did user feedback, but Microsoft was really new at all this stuff at the time, and they really didn't know how to do it. Let's talk about another bad design approach. Assuming a design that works in one place will also work in another. See, what this does is cause teams to copy designs. They've seen a design that seemed to work well in some other venue, and they go, well, why should we go to the trouble of creating our own design when we can just go get that one and copy that? Well, there's nothing wrong with that if the domains are overlapping enough that the design that worked over there will also work for you. But in many cases, that's not the case at all, because a good design, and the better the design is, the more this is likely to be true, a good design is optimized for a particular set of circumstances. It isn't a good design in and of itself. It's a good design for that purpose. And your purpose needs to match it, or it won't be a good design for you. So we ran into this back with one of the first applications that my team produced. We did an app back in 2008 for temporary staffing. And it was used by Microsoft as their demo app for, the WPF platform that came out at that time. That was their demo app for WPF for several years. They didn't have a lot of examples of business apps with some interesting, innovative sort of design. We pushed the limits. For 2008, this was pretty advanced. And it was copied literally thousands of times because there were videos of it on the web, and it was one of the few there. Well, one of the companies that copied it was 3M, who does a radiology reporting app. Now, this app is for temporary staffing salespeople to match up temporary employees with temporary jobs. This app is for radiologists to create radiology reports. Just how much overlap is there between those two sets of circumstances? So they copied staff links, it failed. And they called us, and well, of course it failed. Radiologists aren't salespeople. So we went up and helped them design this. This was 2010. And we helped them design this app. And what we did was go back to sort of a blank sheet approach, just like we did with that temporary staffing app, and try to come up with ways to make it innovative using these new technologies. Not cool now. I don't really think this app looks that cool, but it was highly innovative. Why? Well, because starting fresh, you can question assumptions for how things work. And I vividly remember the meeting in which this assumption was questioned, because we were looking at how how doctors create these radiology apps. Today, they normally dictate, or sometimes they select options that would insert text into the report. And the report looked more or less like it was produced on a Selectric typewriter, because the original reports from dictation were done that way. And the automated versions up to that time were just basically automated versions that produced the same kind of report. My question was, I guess I should talk about this because you may not know how radiology reports work. The doctor says, he sees something in an image, and he says, yes, in the upper medial left, they have a whole language to describe where in the image they're talking about. And the question I asked was, instead of all that, why can't we just grab a piece of the image and stick it in the radiology report? Because we got the technology to do that now. 5 years ago, we really didn't, practically, but now we do, because we have this whole new wave of technology. And I remember the looks on the face, 2 doctors in the room as well as a whole bunch of developers, and they go, yeah, I guess there's no rules or laws or anything. I guess we could do that. And that turned out to be the feature that caused that system to move from a second-tier player to a top-tier player. They sold, what was it, 400 million in the first 5 years. And that screenshot that you saw is about the only screenshot you'll find on the web because they don't like their competitors to see it, to get too much of an idea of the design. So there's a difference between cool and innovative. This app was innovative because it questioned assumptions and came up with a better way of thinking about things. Some people might have looked at that and go, oh, that's cool. I can certainly imagine a doctor looking at, oh, that's cool. But as I said, cool isn't necessarily bad in and of itself. It's whether or not it fits what the user needs. And that became kind of the defining feature of that app. Here's another bad design approach. Laziness. It's regrettably common. Let's show an example that many of you have probably heard of, even though you may not have seen the actual screen. How many of you heard about the nuclear alert? The nuclear alert in Hawaii, 5 or 6 years ago, when the entire island was told that the missiles were coming. Well, here's the screen where that guy made the mistake. This is like, I don't know, no design at all, really. And understand that this software is to be used in emergencies. Now, one of the basic principles of design is when people are going to get distracted, you have to do an extra good job of design. Remember the pilots in the F-35s. Your responsibility goes up. Instead, somebody just throws some stuff on a web page. Okay, this is awful, and there's no excuse for it really, because I sat down and roughed out an interface in Microsoft Word in 3 minutes that would prevent you from making that mistake a very, very high percentage of the time. And all I did was kind of put in some spacing and add a little colored label there. This is not a drill, in sort of red to tip off people. See, the reddish colors, our brain is culturally programmed to think that that's a potential problem, potential danger. So design principles use things like that to keep people from making mistakes. So laziness, it happens all over the place. Among a lot of developers, there is an attitude that if I just make it work, man, it didn't work last month, so I'm done. I've done my job because it's possible to do this thing that couldn't be done before. Well, here's the kind of problem that leads to. Does this mean anything to any of you? Well, it didn't mean anything to the maintenance guy at the Notre Dame Cathedral either when it popped up on the alarm system. And by the time he figured out what it meant and they got to the place that it told them was a problem, the place was in the process of almost burning to the ground. So no design at all. That's extreme laziness. I mean, it would have been some work, but gosh, how hard would it have been to sort of take that and put some text up to go with it? Developers also tend to get into some bad design areas by designing what appeals to them as opposed to what's right for the users. I'm particularly hard on the wall of data grids pattern. Not because I think data grids should never be used. There are circumstances where they're the best option. An example would be certain financial type interfaces. It should be in a data grid. That's the natural way. That's the way the accountants think. But in general, data grids tend to be used because they're easy. You just set them up and tell what data goes in. Let the users figure out how to sort and move the columns. That's the easy, lazy way to do it. And it appeals to us because what that does, as developers, is now we don't really have to understand the user's job that well. We know all we need is to figure out what columns of data they need for their job. We don't have to figure out how they're using it. So we find the columns they need, we throw it in a data grid, we stick that on the screen, and then they have to put up with that problem for however many years that they use the system. It slows them down. And then another place that laziness tends to crop up, and I kind of understand this one because the technologies to fix this easily are fairly new. But that is, if a user comes up and says, man, I'm a power user and I have to have this field right here. Nobody else cares. So what do? He's not going to give up until you give him his data. So you stick another data field on the screen. And now let's multiply that by how many dozens? Is this a familiar scenario for you? What do you end up with? Crowded screens with all kinds of stuff on them that most people don't need. In the modern app world, we have the ability to use templates and dynamic UI to only show things to people that need to see them. Takes some extra work to do that, but it's a big payoff for the user. But, it appeals to us to just say, okay, if that's the data you need, then I'll give it to you. And everybody else will have to see it too. I also see some cases, even though browser-based apps are the predominant way of doing software now, and they should be, but there are certainly cases where the team says, well, we're doing a browser-based app just because we don't want to have to worry about deployment. Stick it on a web server and it's done. There are certain applications that the robustness, the speed, the configurability, et cetera, the state management, the multi-monitor capabilities of native platforms turn out to be a much better match than browsers. Now, that's a small percentage of overall apps, 10, 20% maybe. But I do see teams that they're clearly in that situation, but they understand browser stuff. They don't want to think about the deployment issues, so they just, okay, we're going to do it in a browser then. If you hear somebody say, well, yeah, it could be better, but the users just need more training on it, that's the red flag for that particular situation. Our convenience shouldn't be trumping the user's needs. If we can double the speed of a user by, for example, getting a native app, and I've seen that, by the way, native apps that increased the speed of the user by 100%, then how many more users are there than developers? Quite a number of them. So our convenience shouldn't trump their needs. It's not good business for that to be the case. You can avoid some of these mistakes by vetting the designs anytime that you've got a particularly radical change, and particularly when your team is relatively naive at the whole design process and how to do things, then you're probably going to make mistakes and you want to catch those mistakes early. And that's tricky, actually. Part of the reason that it's tricky is that existing users, have a sunk cost in the system as it exists today. I don't care how hard it is to use, they've figured it out. And they don't realize necessarily that there can be better designs. In many cases, they won't believe that there can be better designs until you put something clearly better in front of them. So that being the case, they will give you pushback during feedback, and that you have to manage that. You do want to listen to them, and you do want to respect their positions, but you don't want users to prevent innovation that's really good for the business just because they're comfortable with the old system. You do prototyping and usability testing, things like that, depending on how many users do you have, what's the turnover, how hard is it to learn, and how easy can we make it. Those kinds of things become more and more important as you build up large user bases because the payoff for them. Because they do take investment. These things aren't free. They do cost time and money. So you do it when the payoff is big. But one of the easiest tricks to try to vet designs is that when you're going out to design things as a team, you don't do what most teams do today, which is to come up with one design and show it to the users and then see what they don't like and grind on that for a while and then take it back and some people call that design process protocycling. You just keep grinding. You will actually get better results faster if you come up with multiple design possibilities to solve a particular design issue. And now that's not necessarily easy. It becomes easier when you do it. But you just kind of put this, okay, this is a perfectly acceptable design. We'll put this aside, and then we'll see if we can find something better. And we find 2 or 3 or maybe even 4, and then we show that to the users. You get much, much better feedback when you show people multiple designs. You ever been in that meeting where you show, well, here's the screen, here's the app. And the meeting breaks down into a food fight over, no, I think that should be above that, and that should be below that, and it should be 3 pixels over, and I don't like the colors. How many of you have been in that meeting at one time or another? Yeah, I see the head nods out there. You avoid that with multiple design possibilities, because now they're going, which one of these matches my job better? That you've raised their cognitive processing to a much higher level. You've gotten it away from minutia. So, multiple design competition is a great trick there. In fact, it has another use in avoiding status quo bias. True story. Those are the best ones. I was working with a Fortune 500 company in America in transportation, and I worked with 6, 7 different teams to redesign their modules in the brand new system. One of the managers came to me before we started on them and said, I understand you don't like data grids. Well, it's true, I don't, but I don't necessarily bar them. I just think there are better alternatives. And he said, well, my users will love their data grids. And I've promised them they won't lose their data grids. Man, that's pretty extreme status quo bias. They're already telling you at the beginning they don't really change anything. And this is for produce ordering. It's an order entry app. So what I said to him was, well, you might be right. I know he's not, but that's okay. I'll let him think that he might be. You might be right. But we are committed to this idea of multiple designs that compete with one another. So we'll do the grid-based design and let the users have a shot at that. But we'll do some alternatives that they can look at too for comparison. And see, at this point, he doesn't know what to do. Because I haven't said no, but I haven't said yes either. And a lot of managers at that level are kind of used to getting what they want by just stating and intimidating. Well, the bottom line at the end of the day, that app was considered extremely innovative, and it's got no data grids in it. We came up with a much better design than that. Another approach that I would consider a temptation for many teams as they're getting started in this. Remember, people in the developer community would rather be doing other things. So there is a temptation to do things that kind of seem like design, but they aren't really design. I call that design theater. So we talked about one of those. Asking for feedback, but tipping off the user what you want. That's one way there. Another one is to build something first and then get feedback without going through really design at all, without talking to the users that much. And I'll talk about why that's bad in a minute. Designing from assumptions that might not be true without making sure those assumptions are correct, and they do apply. Meaningless phrases like user-centric, which is very overused. I try never to use that. Designing by implementing backlog items. Some agile teams fall into what I consider a trap there. Because the problem with that is now the only thing you're ever going to really design is little pieces off the backlog. And design of the app as a whole needs some big picture thinking. And you're not going to get to that by designing individual features. So designing off the backlog, I think, is kind of design theater. Assuming design equals aesthetics. That's a pretty bad one there. But managers are particularly susceptible to that one. I get phone calls from them from time to time. Well, we've about finished this application, and we'd like you to put a good design on it. No, you're unclear on the concept here. What he means is he wants me to decorate it with nice aesthetics, which actually I'm no good at. I have somebody on my team who's really good at it, but I am no good at that. I'm a designer. So A lot of the reasons for that, as I said, is that code-centric developers do sometimes resist embracing design. So they'll say things like, the users don't know what they want. We have to build something to show them. They can't tell us what they want. I am indebted to Alan Cooper. I always thought this, but I'm indebted to him for the confidence to tell you, because he is one of the most foremost interaction designers in the world. Anybody know who he is? Oh, that's tragic. How many of you use Visual Studio? You're using Alan Cooper's work. He invented the drag and drop development environment for what became Visual Basic 1, which is the ancestor of today's Visual Studio. Foremost interaction designer, and I saw him speak. He was doing the keynote at an event at Microsoft in their Patterns and Practices group, if you remember that group. And he said this, it's just a total cop-out, that you have to build something and then show it to them. If you do that, the end result will be something that's just good enough that the users will put up with it. It's very, very unlikely that it will be innovative or anywhere near optimal as a design. Now, it is true that users cannot design screens. That is not their job. That's not the point. Users understand their jobs and their workflow. They have to do it. And when somebody says, the users don't know what they want, we have to build something and show them, what they're missing is that finding out from the users what their flow looks like, understanding their job, that itself is a skill. And they're admitting they don't have that skill. That's fine. Okay, at one time I couldn't hit a baseball. I couldn't ski. But I built those skills up. So what their implicit assumption is, because I can't do it, nobody can do it. And that is false. It's clearly false. We got 20 years of history to show that it's false. Understanding how to get that information out of users, there's enormous literature on this throughout the design community. I don't mean to say it's easy, but it is a skill that can be developed and effectively done. And that's the way you get to innovation, to draw that out of them and then design with the picture of the user in your head. Now, of course, as I said, a lot of you would rather be doing other things, and some of you don't really like talking to people very much. Okay? I mean, in fact, I've joked in the past that some of you have a substance abuse problem, and the substance you abuse is code. It's like, man, you got to write that code. You just have to. I can tip you off as to how to know if you're a code addict. You're in the meeting where something new is being discussed that you're going to work on. The meeting is scheduled for 90 minutes. Less than 10 minutes into the meeting, you are coding the solution in your head and no longer listening to the person talking to you. Does that sound familiar to some of you? That's the sign of an addiction. You can't put it aside. It's worse than smoking. You can't put it aside for 90 minutes. So there's also a common false sort of understanding, false conceptual understanding of what a designer is among developers. Their concept is that the designers are special, colorful creatures. And they can do things that the turkey vulture developers over there who are looking on in envy, that they're just not the same type of person and they can't do it. That's really a completely false way of looking at it. 90% of developers can effectively participate in design. So don't buy into this false idea that you can't. Now, the 10% that can't, I can tell you what they're like. You know people like this. They have that mindset that if I think it should be this way, then I don't understand how anybody else could prefer something different. You know people like that? Well, we all do, right? Those people suck at design. And the reason why is pretty clear, isn't it? They can't put themselves in the mind of the user. Every user should think just like them as far as they're concerned. So there are developers that can't design, but they're a very small minority. And I say this having trained literally thousands of developers over the last 15 years. So you can do much better than you think. Another bad approach, as I said, that to build and then get feedback is certainly a problem. Sometimes I hear this stated as, we have to rapidly build the MVP. We have to do an MVP, and we have to get it out quickly. And we'll iterate and refine to a good design. I have never seen that work to produce a good design. It has the same problem I talked about earlier. The design will iterate until it's acceptable, and the users don't gripe about it too much. And then the iteration will stop. And it's really hard to even get to a good design because you're typically starting with something that's really bad. And you put it out in production. And now you got status quo bias because people eventually figured that part out. It's just a bad, bad approach to design your UI by throwing something into an MVP. And the thing about it is, a lightweight design phase does not take that long. For modest-sized projects, a week or two. Bigger projects, 3 or 4 weeks. Designing from assumptions. Why did Microsoft do this in Windows 8? They researched iPad users, and they discovered an interesting fact that a large percentage of them, 80 to 90%, did not understand the concept of a hierarchical file folder set. And you know people like this, the ones that have a desktop that's nothing but a giant block of application shortcuts. They don't understand file folders, or it just doesn't naturally work for them. So Microsoft started Windows 8 with the assumption that folders are where apps go to die. If we put apps in folders, people just won't use them because we're competing with the iPad now. Well, that is true in the iPad world, but that assumption did not hold in the Windows world. How many Windows users, what percentage of Windows users don't get file folders? There are some, but there aren't many. And file folders are so enormously useful that people that do understand them won't put up without them. I talked a little bit about this earlier, but I'm going to hit this a little bit harder. The idea that people think, oh, well, if I get the aesthetics right, then that's a good design. And this, I hate to say this because I admire visual designers who can create a certain feel and get colors right and some of the things, because I can't do that. So I admire them. But when they take that and try to sort of pitch the idea that that is design, well, that's a false equivalence to me. But it's appealing from the viewpoint of developers in many cases, because it gives developers an excuse to delegate the design. Oh, well, we'll get a visual designer to do that. Now I don't have to worry about design. I'll get back to doing my REST API or whatever. Aesthetics are important, but they're only a small part of design. I mean, you do want an app to have a good first impression. People will naturally give the app more credibility and value in their heads if it does have a good first impression and good aesthetics. The problem is the aesthetics can't cover up a really bad design. The cosmetics can only take you so far. So you've seen quite a number of failed design approaches, which I'm going to summarize here in just a moment. How much time do I have left? About 5-6 minutes. So I want to talk just a bit about the different levels of design effort, because some of the problems come up differently, and problems have more impact and more they lose you more money as you move up this scale. So certainly applying layout and graphic aesthetic design is more valuable, does increase the value over the no design situation. But that's by no means the only way that design can be leveraged. You can also see going up to a standalone design where you take pieces of an existing app and redesign it. Data visualizations, better search. Boy, a lot of apps have awful, awful search. That's a step up. You aren't replacing a whole app, but you are trying to fix some of the most important pieces of it. And then you move to that, from that, up to interaction design, where it's typically an entire application, or at least a big part of it. And you're worried about things like navigation between the pieces, the interaction of the pieces. And so that's a step up in terms of the design you worry about. And about half a dozen times in my career, I've had to do design across parts of the organization, multiple applications that I have to coordinate with one another. I tend to call that design thinking. We're applying design thinking because we're typically changing business workflows across the organization when we do that. So, I mean, that's a long way from doing layout and colors and graphics, isn't it? So there's this entire spectrum of different kinds of design effort that you can do. You should kind of understand where you are. The higher you go up that ladder, the more it will cost, the more time you will invest, the more value you'll get, the more the risk is. And the more you need outside help. I mean, you can probably do some of the stuff down here by yourself. You can try it. What's the cost if you fail? Not that big. But the higher up that ladder you go, the more the cost of failure means that getting somebody to help you is helpful. I will say, though, that if you are up in those top two tiers there, you can get some pretty incredibly high payback. I'm not going to go through this in detail because you can do this yourself, and I will make you an offer if your company is interested. I will get on a virtual visit with you and walk through a spreadsheet that helps calculate the return on investment for design in those higher, more complex phases. And it bases that estimate on how many users do you have, how much do they use the app a day, how much can we speed them up, how much do we pay them. It takes those factors and then rolls them all in. And we've seen real cases where our clients saved tens of millions a year with better design. Now, that's admittedly large user bases, but saving tens of millions a year when the whole design effort didn't cost $1 million that's a pretty impressive return on investment. So there's the link for that. There's an Excel version and there's a Google Sheets version that you can grab a copy of and work with if you like. And as I said, you can ping me and I'll help you walk through it if you like. So let's summarize those bad design approaches. Doing no design at all, yeah, okay. Copying a design. By the way, I'll take questions as I'm going through the review if any of this sort of makes you think of a question you had. Designing for the convenience of the development team. Users don't know what they want. Yeah, well, develop the skill to figure it out. Don't just give up. Wouldn't it be cool if, red flag, as soon as you hear it, make sure that you're not doing something just for the coolness. Design theater. Getting the feedback you want by sort of pushing the users, nudging them the way you want, assuming design equals good aesthetics, and don't fall into we have to build something to show them. Instead, some of the durable, effective design practices include focusing on the users, not the technology or your convenience. If you understand your users and what they want and need, your chances of design failure go down pretty dramatically. Keep asking questions and testing assumptions. I'll tell you a story from that. You have to kind of develop this sensibility as you're working with users. I had this set of users. They were helping a team develop an app that was a call center app. And what they wanted to do was do some data visualizations for things about the person that they're talking to, the user's talking to, so they know what question to ask them. And so we talked about several visualizations over the span of about 20 or 25 minutes. And I got the sense after a while and just asked the inconvenient question that the team had never asked themselves, which is, could you do an algorithm that would just come up with the question you want to ask? They thought about it for a bit and said, yeah. I said, well, then just show them the question you want to ask. Why are we worrying about all this visualization to make it easy for them to figure the question out? It's still a puzzle. Just tell them the question. And then, oh, Oh, yeah. So ask those inconvenient questions. Do good evaluation, do very deep and comprehensive evaluation. Boy, the F-35 people certainly didn't do that. And as I said, focus on the things that drive returns, and I'll help you with that if you like. All right, I have a Pluralsight course on design principles. If you're interested in taking a look, if you happen to have a Pluralsight subscription, you can spend 4 hours listening to me babble about design principles. That course is 10 years old and still generating a lot of views. I'm really surprised about that. Okay, so you can get me. I'm expensive, but you can get me to do some of these things here. But I do like to spread the word about a lot of these things, so you can get a free web meeting to discuss some of these things. A recent one that's very popular is how can we apply UX design to a legacy application? Because that's a bigger challenge than replacing the whole thing and doing a complete design effort. All right, we have, oh gosh, we're right at time. We might have, but we're at the end of the day there, so why don't we see if there's any questions? One or two maybe. I won't hold you long. You're welcome to come up afterwards. By the way, I'm leaving for the airport pretty early tomorrow, about 7:30. So you won't see me tomorrow. Grab me today if you have anything to say to me. Any questions? Right there.
When you're talking about design and how it's important for it to be easy for the user to use and all that, why does your website not support HTTPS? So I have to
because we're busy designing stuff for other people and we don't have time to do our own. The number of people who do this in the industry is shockingly limited compared to the demand. And yeah, we talk about that every time we get together. Yeah, we ought to get our website done. And it's been 5 years, at least, since the last time we refreshed it. Not to mention that the hosting company had a meltdown and lost a lot of our WordPress stuff. And I can give you my tale of woe. But basically, no time. We understand the problem. Anything else? Right there? Design systems. Design systems have a place in design. They help get a lot of the interaction patterns at the granular level correct. And they get the cosmetics correct. And especially for corporate apps, nothing wrong with using a good design system to get the look and feel of the app up to a professional sort of level. So I have no problem with design systems. In our experience, for the complex things we get into, they never cover everything. They're just kind of at that low end, getting the aesthetics and a little bit of the interaction right. They don't tell you, what do I need to put on the screen to accomplish this task? They're no good for stuff like that. Some behind there, next.
The idea of applying UX design to legacy apps.
Yes.
Any tips or advice or anything like that trying to introduce, should we say, more senior managers?
Yes, senior, yes. Well, in my experience, there's two kinds of senior managers. The ones who are driven by spreadsheets and the ones that are driven by video. Okay? The ones that are driven by video, you show them examples. Our app could look like this. The ones that are driven by money and spreadsheets, my spreadsheets are good. You're going to get a lot of return. And of course, some people kind of need both. But it's also important for them to understand what you're talking about when you say design, because it's very possible, probable even, that their concept of the meaning of that word is not close to the meaning I would ascribe it to it. They may think that it's all about the visual aesthetic stuff, or that it's about the fancy stuff, the animations and such, when it's not. So make sure they understand what you're talking about when you say design. All right, I would love to talk about this stuff as long as you would sit here, but I know you've had a long day and I've kept you about 5 minutes longer than otherwise need be. So thank you very much. You may come up and talk to me afterwards, but I've enjoyed being with you. And please catch me here or tonight if you have anything else you want to discuss. Thanks a lot, folks.